Okay, continuing on with things that you should avoid is relativism. And as you can see, its concepts of truth and moral values are not absolute, but they're relative to the person. So, for example, and this is an easy one to go for, if I were to ask a group of any conservative side of a religion, how do you define marriage? They're going to give me one answer. If I ask gays and lesbians, how do you define marriage? It's going to be a different definition. If I ask middle of the road people, I may have a third definition. That means that the definition of marriage is kind of hard to pin down because it's not an absolute value, but according to the person you talk to, they're going to have their own idea of what the definition of marriage is. And that's going to change from person to person, and this is what relativism is. And it's somewhat of a predominant way to look at problems in the United States right now is we have moral relativism, that we tend to talk about and conclude our discussions, analyses, etc., based on what we believe, not what is an objective truth. And so philosophers have always tried to make sure that they stay away from relativism and that they stay away from dogmatism, because otherwise you're not really truly questioning to get to your conclusion. You're already starting with a biased position. So to make and critique arguments, and basically an argument is leading you, is the steps that you put forth in order to logically come to a conclusion. And in an argument, premises are provided to justify a conclusion. So you put forth different premises. Premise 1 is this. Premise 2, this. Premise 3, something else. And then once you go through the pros and cons of each of the premises, that will lead you to your conclusion. More specifically, sorry, I gotta go back in. You need to figure out, though, premises that you're starting with, is it true? So, for example, if we want to look at murder, if our first step to looking at murder is the unlawful taking of a life, is that a true premises? And then if we say, well, yes, it is. Murder is an unlawful taking of life. Then we need to make sure that they're sufficient to lead us to the ability to examine the issue of murder to come to a conclusion on its moral and ethical value. Is it right or wrong? Then we would decide, okay, what are some examples of murder that we can take into account and look at the different arguments. One thing to keep in mind with are the premises true is that, for example, with murder, if we say it's an unlawful taking of life, then we have to look at different examples of it, put forth different premises. For example, we could look at abortion, you could look at death penalty, you could look at a robbery situation, you could look at self-defense. And so you start getting into more complicated matters trying to decide if murder is ethical or not. And then if you come out with more pros and say that murder is ethically right, then it would be right. If you have a lot of things you're saying, yes, this is ethical, yes, this is ethical, this premise is ethical, so my conclusion is it's ethical. But if you end up with a lot of no's, that, is abortion murder? If you say no, is self-defense murder? No. Then you're going to end up saying, okay, murder is not unethical in certain situations. So you get into a lot of discussion and start thinking about all these ways of looking at the right and wrong nature of different aspects of the argument.